Good morning, everybody, and it's exciting to welcome you all to our Hazardous Webinar on the LA fires, led by Natural Hazards Research Australia in partnership with AFAC. And it's great to see the many hundreds of you joining this morning. It really sees the appreciation and enthusiasm and the interest in the topic and building resilience here in Australia for wildfire, bushfire disasters. Our panel today is obviously going to focus on the implications of the LA fires for Australia, and I'll introduce the panel shortly. But firstly, my name is Andrew Gissing. I am the CEO of Natural Hazards Research Australia. I would like to start this webinar with an acknowledgement to country. I am on Wongal country this morning, and I want to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land that we're on and the lands that you are all on as well today. Acknowledge First Nations people on our webinar and to elders past, present and emerging on the lands of the Wongal people here today, and also where you join us today from. Just a couple of housekeeping before we get going as well. Today's panel session will be recorded and a link made available next week. We'll also be doing Q&A today, so please place your questions in the Q&A panel, and we will endeavour to answer as many questions in as panel as we can. If you have any technical difficulties at all in the webinar this morning, please also again use the Q&A function. So without further ado, I will introduce our esteemed panel members today. Each of them are going to talk for 5 minutes before we then enter into our panel session where we'll get a chance to answer all those questions. And so very excited to have Kelly Martin firstly join us. So Kelly runs Lasair Fire Consulting, is a volunteer firefighter. She's also spent time on the ground as a firefighter, volunteer firefighter in LA. She's got over 40 years of fire management experience with the US National Park Service, US Forest Service. She was also culminating as Chief of Fire and Aviation at the Yosemite National Park. She's also been the immediate past president of the International Association of Wildland Fire. So welcome, Kelly. And two faces that probably are more familiar to folk on the call there as well. Firstly, we've got Professor David Bowman from the University of Tasmania that we're very fortunate to have leading research on behalf of Natural Hazards Research Australia, and the great work that he and his team do at UTAS, and obviously 40 years of research and science experience, and also Rob Webb. So Rob's the CEO of AFAC, very passionate about resilience and our emergency services across the country, bringing 30 years of combined experience in working with those services. And I know how passionate Rob is, particularly about this topic and understanding the lessons and how they apply in the Australian context. So we will very shortly hear from our panellists, but firstly, a few scene-setting comments from myself. So LA fires, as they've contemporarily been called here in Australia, at least 20 people killed, more than 16,000 structures destroyed, millions of people exposed to toxic smoke. The ratings agency Finch has placed economic damages at around $150 to $275 billion US, which is enormous. And now tens of thousands of people are answering their own individual recovery journeys. So when we think about the area that these fires occurred, Los Angeles, California, is one of the most fire-prone parts of the world. We've actually seen since 1990 24 individual billion-dollar wildfire disasters globally. 21 of these have occurred in the US. Much, however, of this risk, in my view, is foreseeable. And certainly I'll agree with some of the comments that David Bowman has made in some of his pieces that he's written after the LA fires, that this is something that is possible in the Australian context. In such extreme conditions as what occurred in LA, little could be done by first responders to save property as fires ran. But however, when we think about the urban planning decisions to build in areas of known fire risk, that's what really created the fundamental conditions for this disaster to occur well before the fire ignited. Research has shown properties exposed to wildfire actually increased 40% in the decades leading up to the fire disaster. I think about the LA fires as a grey rhino event, an event which is obvious, but often overlooked, and is a little bit different to what we call black swans, which are rare events which are uncertain and unforeseeable. This event was foreseeable, but perhaps overlooked for various reasons. And many disasters are like this. So, for example, when we think about COVID-19, we all knew that a global pandemic could occur, but we were left unprepared for the event globally. So we must challenge ourselves to think about the obvious in the Australian context as well. Those risks that we might also be overlooking that might have catastrophic consequences. I think of things about southeast Queensland, and this week we've got a cyclone in the Coral Sea heading towards the Queensland coast. What happens if, just like in the past, we had a cyclone cross at Brisbane, Gold Coast, similar to the 1954 event at Coolangatta? We continue to build in these areas without cyclone building standards, and also on floodplains across the country, further exacerbating risks. So these are the sort of things that I think of. We're also seeing the nature of disasters change globally, and we're seeing societies and governments struggle to adapt in time before the disasters occur. And this further reinforces the needs for transformational thinking, and is one of the key reasons why NHRA we've been leading our Be Ahead of Ready program. As I've been speaking to chiefs and executives across the country, these LA fires are posing some significant questions. Some of those include, what were the key drivers of the destruction in LA, particularly in the urban areas, and how could fire authorities in Australia manage similar events? Why was loss of life so low relatively to the building destruction and loss? How will communities recover, particularly with insurance uncertainties? What will the long-term health effects be across those communities that were impacted? And as we saw in the LA context, a lot of misinformation and disinformation. How could that eventuate in Australia, and how could that be managed in the Australian context as well? We know these fires are already having impacts in Australia. A recent survey released last week by IAG found that nearly half of their customers are concerned about their safety and protection needs following the LA fires. There's already some useful research coming out from the US about the fires and the destruction. Some of the key findings have been that the disaster was a result of the combination of human exposure, drought, and significant winds. That wind vectors aligned with the orientation of major roads, which allowed fires to rapidly spread through convective fuels like privacy hedges, combustible fences, across the community, overwhelming suppression resources. That most structures were actually built before modern codes came into force and were densely positioned in the urban environment. And the fire suppression was hampered by limited window to prevent fire spread, loss of aerial attack due to high winds, insufficient water supply due to the scale of events, the extreme fire conditions themselves, and the evacuation traffic and the abandonment of vehicles blocking access. So they are some key points by way of introduction to set the scene this morning. I will now like to hand over to Kelly to provide her first 5 minutes. Thank you, Kelly.
I'd really like to thank NHRA and Andrew and Nathan for the invite today. I'm just super humbled to have this opportunity, but I'm only just one of thousands of firefighters to share my story about our journey and observations of the January 2025 LA fires. I retired in 2019 after 35 years of federal service as a wildland firefighter. I now try to give back to my community as a volunteer firefighter with the Whitebird Fire Department. We serve a community of less than 100 people. Within 24 hours of these devastating wildfires that occurred in and around Los Angeles on January 7th, the call came out from California Office of Emergency Management. We responded as part of the Emergency Compact Agreement, which is a national interstate mutual aid agreement that enables states to share resources with each other during times of disaster. Paul, Brian, and I were part of Idaho Task Force 4 and one of 5 task force from Idaho. Our journey began on January 9th. We headed south for our 2-day drive out of the Idaho winter through the Great Basin to the warm ocean breeze of Malibu. I had plenty of time to contemplate what we were about to experience. I was hopeful my decades of experience in operations and fire behavior could somehow calm my agitated mind. As we entered the fireground, I felt like every visual I had recalled a deep memory of my fire career. Early in my career, I helped communities prepare for wildfires to hopefully accept more good fire on the landscape. I grew up with Smokey Bear mantra, only you can prevent wildfires. Many people living in these high hazard, high risk environments are very aware of the persistent threat of wildfires and believe that the use of good fire on the landscape is just too risky, especially in California's chaparral landscape. And to this day, default mindset of suppressing all fires and limited prescribed fire prevails. We intuitively know that each year passes with no fire. We are only adding to the fire deficit year after year after year until one day everything goes up in smoke and flames all at once. As we tried navigating the LA traffic in a large fire truck, it was a gripping experience for those of us who live and work in rural communities. Fortunately, we found the people of LA allowed us a wide berth and would honk and wave, grateful for the hundreds of fire engines that showed up to support the fire suppression effort. By the time we showed up on the fire line, the deadly Santa Ana winds had passed. Our job was to patrol and extinguish any flare-ups that could reignite the east side around Sunset Boulevard. Our engine crew approached every day as a new exploratory experience as we tried to fit the pieces of the puzzle together as to how this became one of the costliest and most devastating fires in US history. Talking to local fire companies from LA City, LA County, and CAL FIRE, they described how many of these communities were built post-World War II during the housing boom without much consideration to the threat of wildfire, fire-wise principles, or home hardening. We saw home after home with carefully manicured hedges that reached 10 to 12 meters tall with an average home separation between 5 and 10 meters. These two facts led me to imagine the sheer volume of massive ember production from privacy hedges that could be transported several blocks ahead of burning homes, only to ignite more hedges and homes, significantly outpacing fire suppression resources. Complicating suppression efforts during the Santa Ana wind event was the tremendous force of the Santa Anas on January 7th, combined with minimal rain in the previous eight months. I tried to imagine myself navigating the many narrow dead-end roads, an extremely dangerous condition for responders and for the public, especially when evacuees encounter incoming fire suppression resources. My vision of whole blocks and whole neighborhoods that just disappeared will be one of the most remarkable experiences of my fire career. One home stands out as emblematic of these LA fires, likely a beautiful custom home made of rock, stone, and metal. Clearly, the homeowners must have felt that their home could withstand a wildfire, but somehow the embers must have entered the interior of the house and burned the house from the inside out. Shrubs and trees around the exterior part of the house remained unburned. Emotionally, this was one of the toughest wildfire moments of my life. Picturing whole communities celebrating Christmas and New Year's with family and friends just 2 weeks before. Holiday decorations still lining the streets and trying to fathom the unimaginable loss of memories, of home, of communities that just vanished in less than 24 hours. We did the best we could to help returning homeowners find the smallest of memories, which gave us a convincing sense of service. I took great comfort in finding flowers beginning to emerge after such devastation. Finding colorful new blossoms became my daily therapy. I really want to thank all of you very much for your time today in logging in. I have plenty more stories and pictures and hope that you are able to find shared experiences with mine in hopes of reinforcing the extremely important work that you are doing now and into the future to protect people, our communities, and our precious natural and cultural resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm now going to call upon David.
Hi. So yeah, that's a really fantastic context to put it into a human and personal frame, Kelly. And I want to sort of do likewise, but at a much bigger scale. So how did I feel about the LA fires? I felt very shocked and very concerned, but possibly for a whole lot of different reasons. And I want to explain why those reasons are important, and I want to explore what we're going to have to do if my conclusions were right. So why I was shocked is that the LA fires were, in a sense, the culmination of a whole lot of signals that we've been receiving globally about wildfire activity. So to be clear, the LA fires aren't the only recent fire disaster, but they're probably the one that will be the iconic fire disaster. Of course, you know, the Lahaina fires in Hawaii, the fires in Greece, the fires in 2019-20 in Australia and Chile and all the rest of it make what I would say is a solidification of the problem. But the problem is now solid. We're certain the science is in, that we can see global climate change is now affecting fire regimes and is driving more extreme fire behaviour globally and creating fire behaviour that is going to not only overwhelm our mainstream fire suppression efforts, but impact our habitat, our homes, our life, our livelihoods. So this is a sort of a visceral realization when you realize what's actually being put on the chopping block. This is serious now. And so that's another way of saying that that event is the fork in the road in terms of our problem solving. And I want you to think about the response you have to that fork in the road, because the easiest thing to do is to bounce back, and bouncing back is to basically recreate the problem, priming the cannon to explode again. So people talk about bouncing forward or adapting. What are we going to do to adapt? And broadly, I see the adaptation pathway, the debate that we're going to have, the struggle, the intellectual struggle that we're going to have, the philosophical struggle, is do we, and I feel, I would say, do we be seduced by the siren call of technology, that this problem can be solved by kit and technology? Because that's actually a really convenient, and I'm not saying technology can't contribute, but imagine if technology could completely solve the problem, that perfect awareness of the landscape, perfect ability to extinguish any dangerous fire. But of course, what would go with that would be an apathy in the community, because Big Brother is solving the problem. And also it's going to cost a lot. So we're sort of outsourcing it. The alternate pathway is the grassroots pathway, where we empower communities to adapt to these changes and to really reduce the risk in the communities, to build a constituency all over again, just as we did in the colonial period, understanding that we needed, you know, the origin of the volunteers were people who were trying to look after their communities. So maybe nothing else is new under the sun. We're going to go back to the communities. But what I really want to make the point about going back to the communities, again, that's a very seductive idea of shared responsibility, but it's extraordinarily fraught, because it requires empowering communities, which necessarily means devolving power to communities. It requires investing into communities, trusting communities, and also accepting that some communities are going to be more functional than other communities. So there will be social unevenness. There may be social inequity. So we've got to think about how we solve that alternate pathway. And it is interesting that a US Forest Service 50 years ago theorized about the problem of LA, and he came to the same conclusion I came to. Nothing is new under the sun. He realized that no amount of fire suppression effort could ever be really ultimately successful, that you have to start thinking about lots of new ideas. And he was even thinking of what we would call green fire breaks, thinking about using golf courses, irrigation water. It's an extraordinary article by Countryman. To think that somebody was anticipating that. But the point, we have to find a way of doing the research and development to prove that we have solutions that are scalable. We've got to educate and demonstrate those solutions. And most critically, we have to not only penalise, but also incentivise. We need sticks and carrots to bring the community on the journey to make communities safe from this escalating fire threat, because I do not believe that we've got the capacity to solve this problem. Technologically, we don't have the resources to do it, and the technology will be imperfect. We will therefore be setting ourselves up for potentially catastrophic and maybe city-busting fires if climate change continues to worsen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And certainly, just a reminder to everybody, get your questions in the chat. David just said some really great things to prompt some questions. I'm now going to welcome Rob to give his 5 minutes.
Thanks, Andrew, and hi, everybody. Thanks for having me on the panel. I feel like a bit of an imposter with fire experts, but as Andrew said, I've spent a fair bit of time looking at this and trying to understand it, as I tend to do with many of the natural disasters around the world. It's a great opportunity for us to think about things when we're not under the pump ourselves, to think about what happened. And I think I want to say this at the start, any kind of review of LA hasn't happened yet at the local level. We have to be mindful of that, and there'll be lots of information come out, and we know what we read in the media won't necessarily be the truth. But I want to touch on that a little bit, but I want to start with Australia and think about where we've come in recent times after big events. If we go back to Black Saturday, you think of the amazing work that's come out of the CSIRO through house losses, through the fatalities associated with bushfires, completely changed the approach across Australia to the messaging we're giving communities about what they should do on a bad fire day. Warnings, it's changed the way we do warnings. It's changed the consistency with which we do warnings. A new fire danger rating system. First there was a new category, but then a new fire danger rating system that will seek to deal with the future and be more flexible for the future as different regimes emerge under climate change, and ultimately community messaging in general, and how we speak about fire and the urgency with which we speak about fire. But I also look at LA in terms of what worked and some of the things I saw that I could only dream of at different times in my weather forecasting background. But if you think about the preparedness, I made a comment earlier in the week about the front page of the LA Times on the morning of the 7th of January. Half the front page talked about, and I'll read some things, life-threatening and destructive. And they had the LA Fire Department spokesperson saying, this upcoming event is extreme. Many people think that when winter months come, they might be out of fire danger. That is certainly not the case in Southern California. So to get that kind of coverage, even the strength of the forecast on the Black Saturday fires back in 2009 managed to get a tiny little corner at the top. Same with Ash Wednesday, even though the forecasts may well have been predicting similar levels or dangers. So there was a prepared community and an aware community, and discussions of people trying to evacuate early. I'll talk about that. Risk, the US at a national level have very strong documentation and policy statements around risk, and with language such as how are we going to cope with the wildfire crisis? And this is coming out from central government agencies and spouting a whole range of different ways, multiple ways, including land management, to deal with this emerging threat. Building codes in California, they were the first, I think, in the US to implement building codes along the urban interface. So all of these things, a high-risk area, it's known to be a high-risk area, a community that we assume was aware, but there is always lessons to be learned, and I want to talk about them a little bit as well. This was a bad day. This is bad. We think about, in terms of fire weather or even general weather, out of the 24-hour period, from 7 a.m. in the morning to the next morning, over half of that day was over 40 km/h average winds. They had 6 hours of over 50 km/h with peak gusts of 120 km/h. That exceeds anything, those in Melbourne, that exceeds the big wind event that knocked all the trees down back in 2021 or 2 around the Dandenongs. Those types of winds alone without fire would cause widespread destruction over land. We see it time and time again, westerly gales across Sydney or Melbourne. So FEMA, when you look at their disaster recovery, are looking at the wildfires and straight line wind damage from this event. So this is massive, not only from a fire point of view, but the strength of the winds were quite remarkable to be getting from the west, and very rare in Australia that we see the winds that strong. But they are the events that cause most of the damage. We're really interested in talking with people around the country. Why were the fatalities so relatively low? They were tragic, 28 deaths, I believe, but compared to some of the Australian deaths, they are very low. Now, that might be because of the nature of the fires and the urban environment, but they still had the same challenge of affecting those who living with a disability or the elderly who were less able to help themselves. And we need to get on top of that. That's a real issue here, and an issue that we must think about in the way we set up our the entire disaster system. Things like evacuation modelling, understanding and testing our evacuation modelling. We need to be thinking of that. And thinking about, does the US evacuation culture, which is much stronger than Australia, going back to whether it's there's tornado days, hurricane days, for decades, they've had this concept of leaving. It's not perfect, but they've had a concept that's built into the culture of leaving, and they're expecting to be told to leave, issues in itself. This one, we need to look at bushfire-prone areas. What do we mean by that? What do we know at the top end of our events in the future years, or even now, how deeply these fires will penetrate, and what does that mean to the language we use and what we tell people, and how we look at that? Leads on to understanding these urban conflagrations that are common in the US, have happened here, and I've got no doubt with the types of weather that they saw would be more common if you've got that length of time of sustained elevated fire danger day and night, then you're going to have things like that. The built environment's a really important part for us to be looking at understanding how we retrofit, understanding if we know where we are a little bit shaky, understanding where different houses or properties may affect their neighbours under those types of winds. You've got projectiles that open up new holes and challenges in communities, and embers get in. So we understand it's possible, we understand it happens, but do we really share enough data around Australia to understand and use that to greatest effect? The warning paradigm, they are unforgiving. You could have written it before this event, people looking at text messages they got, waiting for text messages, should I evacuate, as the fire bears down on them. The language used in warnings, mistakes in warnings that are issued to multiple people. There are communities who are hanging on these things, and the importance of us thinking warnings as a process that starts decades before, in terms of the way we prepare communities about how to deal with things, and warnings are just adding on and information. But how do you get the right level of intelligence in those events? That remains to be seen. How you can warn down to the suburban level when you're still trying to get a handle on those fires, the intelligence that's needed to be able to correctly warn people is something that you have to calibrate, and that's our fire agencies would be all over that. Aerial firefighting, the focus, people say, we couldn't use them on the day. They were using aerial firefighting effectively on the day, or maybe not too effectively on the day, but they used it the way they could on the day. But in the days afterwards, to help save more areas, we've got to think of aerial firefighting, not necessarily just trying to put these fires out. It's actually, there's a whole range of different ways it's used. This city, this place is the best resource fire centre in the world, probably. So we need to bear that in mind. That's part of their risk mitigation. I'll just finish by saying we have to hover above this. I feel the same urgency. I feel this, having watched these things for a few, increase and be surprised continually about the, I'm always shocked that they happen, but then I'm not. It's our ability to imagine what might happen, our ability to actually think across the entire system about, the fact is we have to use everything in our toolkit to do this. And that's going to mean focusing on new partnerships more than anything and looking at the shared problems. And we cannot treat a local problem until we understand the length and breadth of that local problem. And that's where we get great benefit from people on the ground, living in community, working with the community to understand what is most important to them and how they live their lives. And this connection all the way back across all parts of government is where the real benefit will be. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Rob. I'm now going to ask our panelists to turn their mics and cameras back on because we will commence our panel, and we've got some great questions already in the Q&A. Please add your questions. Also, there's an opportunity to like the questions that are already there, which means they work their way further up my screen, which there's more chance of me being able to ask. And yes, we'll try and get through as many questions as we can over the next 25 minutes. So I've got a question firstly for Rob and David, one that I know is on the top of everybody's tongue. And so I'll go to maybe David first and then to you, Rob. So are we prepared here in Australia for a similar event? And based upon your answer there, what do we need to change or learn more about to make sure we've got the right strategies, policies, training, if such an event was to occur here in Australia? David?
Well, I don't believe so, and I live in a city which is which could become equally world famous for a fire disaster, you know, for a whole complex of reasons. And my research program, which is funded by Natural Hazards and also the ARC, is basically focused on challenging our research group to find solutions to this problem. And how do you actually find a solution that could scale to get the benefit to drive down the risk? So the answer is no, but I believe that it is tractable, but you've got to do the research and development, but you've also got to do the education demonstration to convince the community it's tractable. And then you've got to incentivize it or punish people if they don't do sensible things, because they're not only engendering danger to themselves, they're also being bad actors in the community.
Thanks, David. Rob?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think it was put really well by Alan Slipovich in an article in Time this week around we're living with the sins of the people who came before us, a couple of 100 years of building. So the reality is, no, we can't stop disasters. We're not going to in Australia, and that isn't necessarily the end game here. Where I think we have to absolutely keep working towards is not adding more risk. You and I have had these conversations, adding risk that the people after us are going to be dealing with into the future. So you can never, ever be prepared enough for these things. And that sort of goes into everything we do. Becomes not, have we done enough? It's what more can we be doing? And that's the way we should be going through as disaster leaders across the country, kind of custodians of the 2025 sector. We've got to be thinking about what we're leaving in 2035 and 2040. And it's really amplifying everything and just looking for that next new partnership that we have to form.
Thanks, Rob. Kelly, so just a question for you. Now that the devastation has occurred, what's next in LA? What's happening in the US at the moment? What's your vision for capturing some of these learnings and ensuring that communities are more resilient?
That's a loaded question. I spent a lot of time, and I'm still spending a lot of time really thinking about everything that I saw. But I think really from a perspective of what do we do with existing communities that we know are just a ticking time bomb. This isn't the last time that we're gonna see this. So I'm really in this space of trying to anticipate where the next disaster is gonna be. But the rebuilding process in LA is going to be years in the making, and you're probably also noticing the threat to insurance. People that have been dropped from insurance, and then also the once they've been dropped, they're part of the state, FAIR plan, and so that's really having a huge financial impact on both, the state as well as homeowners in terms of being able to insure their home against losses like this. And I can tell you that there's so many people that had no idea that something like this could happen, where you got all the way down to the ocean, and the buildings on the ocean side that was on the other side of the highway was actually destroyed as well. So those kind of scenarios, no one ever anticipated anything ever burning on the ocean side. But I think we've got an opportunity to say, is this going to happen again, and where, and what can we do to better prepare, both ourselves as a response, organization and communities. I think we've just got to be in this together. Great,
thanks, Kelly. Now, David, there's a question here in the chat from Daniel. I'm going to try and summarize it. It's a little bit of a long one, but essentially, drawing on your research, you've got a project with us at NHRA looking at bushfire destruction patterns in the urban environment. And the question really goes to, was this a daisy chain scenario? What were the elements from your observations in the urban environment in LA and perhaps in your research in Australia that best sort of contribute to what has happened? We've already heard in some of the statements today things about urban density, connected fuels, privacy hedges, etc. What's your take there?
Really, what's at stake here is there a general theory of house loss and wildfire? That's actually what we're really talking about, because if there is, then that would be rather convenient. Because then we would be able to learn directly from the experience in the United States and apply it not only in Australia, but globally. The alternate explanation is that house loss patterns have a geography, and it means that, because of the types of buildings, the building density, the approach to fuel management and so on is very site or region specific. And so then it means you have to be very careful about drawing direct parallels from, say, LA to Australia. But the one point that I would make is that we do have a pretty good handle on bushfire risk under normal conditions. And so we know that proximity to bushland is a major risk factor, and that is convenient for planning purposes and mapping. The problem is that when you go into these super extreme weather conditions, which are likely to become more and more frequent because of climate change, then you actually start getting a completely new domain of risk. And that means that we're on a risk frontier. We are actually possibly just lucky in Australia that we haven't had such an event, rather than it can't happen here. That's really the fundamental question that we're grappling with. And I would err on the side of caution. And obviously, we need to do more research to understand similarities and differences in house loss events. But I would seriously err on the side of caution. And I suspect the insurers are doing likewise. And that's why there's going to be a global chain reaction from these events in terms of their understanding, their appetite for risk, and the way they're going to price that risk into house insurance premiums.
And I've got a rapid follow-up for you, David, and Kelly, feel free to jump in on this one as well. There's a little bit of interest in the questions there about the differences between perhaps US and Australian approaches, particularly around building construction codes, etc. David, if you're comfortable providing a quick response.
We are actually, before the LA fires, where we're doing a comparative analysis of house loss in California and Australia, believe it or not, although we were frustrated by the availability of data. But the most basic thing you do is you compare climates. And it turns out that the climates of California are most similar to Adelaide and Perth. They're Mediterranean climates. So that's a big stumbling block right up front, that you have to start thinking about climate matching, and then you've got to start thinking in more detail about the sorts of fire weather. You know, the Santa Ana winds are these extraordinary, reliably, seasonally reliable downslope winds, whereas in Australia, we get a completely different sort of synoptic setup for dangerous fire weather. There are some similarities, but there are some very big differences.
And Kelly, any observations from you there?
I will say that new codes are being written as we speak, especially the 0 to 5, which removes all flammable vegetation around the house. But so those are ongoing, and there's backed behind quite a bit of science and data that says that, you know, this is how we can harden our homes and be more resilient to wildfires in the future. The problem is that we just have so many communities that are in harm's way that have been built in this fire environment, and we've been suppressing fires for so long. What do we do with the hundreds, if not thousands, of homes that we know are at future risk? To try to think about, for example, if a community said, you know, we're going to actually reduce all our hedges, then what? You know, is that a guarantee? Is there, you know, broader perspective of doing more fuels treatments, you know, before the wildland actually hits the urban and it develops self-sustaining conflagration? So I think that's what's got my interest, is these older communities. I think the development of new codes are there, and that is certainly helpful. But what do we do about our existing communities?
Thanks, Kelly. And so, yeah, there's also a series of questions in the chat that go to the role of the community engagement. David, you set this up well, talking about tech versus community engagement and community empowerment to solve this very wicked problem. Rob, you guys do a lot of thinking about this at AFAC, and I'm also thinking about ADAR's work here as well. What's your insights from a community empowerment, community leadership perspective?
Yeah, I think I mean, there's some giants of this field online, I'm sure, but to me, it's we often talk about different phases of disaster risk reduction, and response is one of them. But I feel like this whole concept of warning needs to be stretched out to multiple, as I said earlier, multiple decades. So this ability to think with the same urgency and think about emerging risk as well as we understand the environment and where that risk really is, and trying to localize the risk to a level. We're still in the mindset, we are collectively in Australia, there's a mass broadcast, which is how we're thinking. I think there'll become a time in the future where we will understand more. If we do it carefully and work through the ethics, we'll understand more about overcoming the lack of social cohesion by knowing more about where particular threats are evolving in certain communities or neighbourhoods, or families know how best to work with those people. Because often we try and put it through one pipeline, through a channel of the choice of ours, whereas we need to be thinking about how to make it accessible and digestible through the channels that people are comfortable using. And that, as I mentioned before, means new partnerships and sometimes handing over some of the work. And but you can do no better than have people who are living in those communities, whether they be volunteer, paid workforces across different parts of government, all saying a consistent story that builds trust.
And Kelly, you know, I read of many approaches in the US. Any insights from your perspective about community empowerment leadership?
I really like what Rob was just talking about, because I think for so many years and decades, we as emergency response organizations have kind of separated ourselves from, you know, community involvement and engagement. And I really think it's time that we actually, you know, look at those communities that are really doing really good work and amplify their work so everybody else can see that this is actually a grassroots. You know, there's people out there that really, really care about their communities, and they're going to do the work that's necessary that we know will protect them into the future. But where are they, who are they, and what agencies and organizations amplify their work, I think can have a multiplying effect, you know, for other communities to say, well, if they did it over here, I think we can do it over here.
Right. Thanks, Kelly. There's also another question. I'm going to direct this one to you, David. We were only discussing this at the AFAC Community Safety Group the other day, where you gave a presentation on some of the work you've been doing with us. It's about the 100-metre rule. And so it seems to work pretty well for the fires we've experienced to date in Australia. What's your thinking about the 100-metre rule now and into the future based upon the research you've been doing?
No, really good question. And one of the observations of the way we're approaching our research is that practitioners have come up with a lot of really practical and sensible and actionable rules of thumb, if you like. And what we're doing as scientists is putting the science and, you know, the understanding why those rules would work. And it is absolutely true that house loss is concentrated in a band near the wildland or bushland. But as I said, the problem is when you get these extraordinarily extreme fires, that whole benefit of that you know, contained area of risk collapses, because you can get ember storms driving into you know, and that's why we're worried. I mean, theoretically, you could get ember storms right into city centres. You could have, and it is worth noting that in New York, some parks did catch on fire in the autumn. So it is actually not out of the question that, like Sydney, you could have bushland areas burning right in the Sydney harbour, which were ignited by ember storms. And this raises huge questions about how far do we want to go in thinking worst case. And I am of the view that we should be encouraging people, if they have the means particularly, to over-engineer their homes in suburban areas, you know, to go up a BAL rating. Why not, if you can afford it? Because that's probably going to give you some protective benefit, and also be thinking about garden design right at the get-go in new suburbs, and thinking about the amenities that are being put in to new suburbs to start, you know, literally baking in fire breaks, thinking about wastewater and so on. We could really, that's how you're going to get ahead of the game and bounce forward, that you've got to start doing the work, the planning work and the thinking work now. And it does seem a bit crazy and alarmist, but actually in 10 years' time, it might be inspired.
Great, thanks, David. Yeah, I certainly think about embers from the fires here in Sydney in the 1990s, you know, around Lane Cove, etc. So, you know, really deep into metropolitan Sydney, which really goes further to your point. Rob, you know, you've got decades of experience dealing with information in crisis and disasters, particularly in your time at the Bureau. We've spoken about the challenges of accurate information and misinformation, disinformation, particularly in the political landscapes that we work in these days. We've got a question here in the chat. Essentially, you know, what's our thoughts? I'll hand to you firstly, but what's your first thoughts about the challenges and the approaches to managing this?
Thanks. Yeah, it's there's the disinformation, which is the act of working against what might otherwise you think is the right thing to do. And then sometimes misinformation, which for various reasons either starts to erode trust. Again, trust is the key in all of this, and being able to understand, and they talk about the effect of crisis communication in being able to you be confident in what you can do, be empathetic and understand the people on the ground. But this idea or issue of people actively working against it, it probably costs the globe uncountable amount of money in terms of the climate change argument, decades of people arguing if rather than what. And we're now sort of easing our way out of that. When it comes to LA, I'm not sure of the individual, what happened on the day, but I know for certain a couple of the other pieces of information where people are either trying to amplify their own their biases and or the things they're doing. There'll be other sources that are around pushing a political narrative. And then there are just people who are grandstanding and wanting to be wanting to do it for various reasons. The work that I've read, there was a nice article written out of Melbourne Uni, our own John Richardson, about disinformation and knowing about it, knowing where its sources are, and actively planning for it, I think is important. And they talked about debunking as a key thing that came out of some work they did in the UK. Fact, so lead with the truth, put a fact forward, point to false information, explain why it's false, and then go hard with the fact again. So we have to expect it, and we have to be able to counter it. And part of that is connecting and building a trusted network of multiple sources of information that is speaking in a way communities can trust, and speaking to them through the channels that they need. You will get it wrong. We saw it in Spain. It was a really difficult thing to watch in the Valencia floods. I can just imagine what it's like, because I felt it 1,000 times myself, going too hard with flood warnings the previous year, getting absolutely lampooned because you've gone too hard and you're overwarning, and then not wanting to overwarn for the big one. And that the political pressure, the feeling that you feel, it will be affecting agencies everywhere, civil agencies. And then there's the language of our leaders, working with our leaders, political leaders, I mean, to make sure that they are attuned to the right language to be using. Some do it really well, and others, I think, we could be helping them through as part of the induction, I think.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rob. I'm going to just pose a quick question to David and Kelly, mindful of time, so if you can keep your responses relatively short, that would be great. And the shortness of your responses should not reflect the significance of the question, by the way. So there's obviously some land managers on the call. So what's the reflections for land managers, particularly in regards to fuel reduction and Indigenous knowledge, for example? David?
Yeah, look, I want to sort of say that one of the things about the new reality we're in, we've got a attention deficit and a very complicated information ecosystem. And what I think we've got to do with fuel management and cultural burning is explain to the community, demonstrate the value of it. And the best way to do that is to have things like demonstration sites and interpretive trails to build trust in the community. Endless rhetoric and sort of environmental disputation just isn't going to cut it. We've got to lift the community's trust, and the best way to do that is to show and to allow people to experience that you can do this well, it looks nice, and it's going to make communities safe. Right.
Thanks, David. Kelly?
I agree. I think communities also need to learn how to burn, but we also know that there's, and especially Indigenous cultures, tribal cultures that have used fires for, generations long before we showed up. So I think that's a really, really important part of the piece of the puzzle. The problem with what we saw in LA is really steepness of slopes and vegetation that's, 50 to 60 years old, incredibly dense. It either burns like heck or it doesn't burn at all. So in those kind of situations, I think we also need to be mindful of the mechanical treatments and the thinning to reduce the fire severity intensity in that threat defense zone before it enters a community.
Great. Thank you, Kelly. Now I'm going to ask us all a very quick wrap-up question. It's the most popular one in the Q&A for sure, but it was asked to be asked at the end. And so I'll just paraphrase it. So in wrapping up, is there one key change or action that you think is needed here in Australia, or in your case, Kelly, globally or in the US, based upon the lessons of the LA fires thus far, and what would it be? Maybe, Rob, I'll let you go first.
It's hard, Andrew, but look, I think we need to understand deeply, or better understand, the impact of the disasters. We have to assume they're going to be there, understand, be able to imagine what they look like, and build decision support around that. And often we think of decision support as the short-term decision support around warnings, around response. This is about making good decisions and giving governments good decisions. We're stuck at the moment with too many different data sets, not able to share them with researchers, not able to share them with each other. And to accelerate our path forward, we have to be able to gather all of these things and make good decisions based on good research that will lead to the most leaps forward in what we're doing.
Great, thanks, Rob. And I'll go to David now. And yeah, if you can just keep it short, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, what I'd like to do is to be able to, at scale, show that you can dramatically reduce risk, say here in Hobart. And then, as Kelly said right at the beginning, you could get a chain reaction that people could come and see that and go, oh, I can adapt that thinking, that type of fuel management, that type of retrofitting to my community. Because what we've got to do is start tractably, and we've got to get something snowballing to change at massive scale quickly.
And Kelly.
I would just say that, we cannot govern or legislate our way out of this. We have to be very open with our communities and let them know the risk. And I think this is a marker point in time that there were so many people that said, well, I was doing everything right. I was clearing my dead vegetation. I was using xeriscaping. But when you look at the grand scale of what surrounds the whole community and the conditions, especially as we start talking about, climate change and hotter, drier, longer summers and fire seasons, and our ability to attract and retain a robust response organization is also extremely important.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelly. And one for me would certainly be about that we're in a new era of disasters, and that means that we need to be thinking more transformationally. We need to be thinking decades ahead, and really encourage everybody online to engage with NHRA's Be Ahead Already theme there as well, and read up on that and the encouragement to think big for our future. So that's it today. We're clearly out of time. I want to thank our panelists, Rob, Kelly, David, done a fantastic job. I want to say big thanks to everybody for joining us online today. Your enthusiasm and your questions have been fantastic. A special thank you to AFAC for partnering with NHRA on this event, one of many. And I think we'll certainly be having discussions based upon the enthusiasm today for this event about some follow-up discussions into the future there as well. So stay tuned to the outcomes of those. Also stay tuned to NHRA through our regular newsletters. We've got a couple of other webinars coming up. We've got one featuring our work around the Resilient Homes Funds in Queensland as well there, with the University of Queensland and Queensland Reconstruction Authority coming up on the 18th of March. We've also got one around bushfires and power infrastructure on the 29th of April there, looking at Powerlink's work in Queensland around high-risk locations there as well. But it's also very exciting that we're seeing lots of registrations already for our annual forum. So Natural Hazards Research Forum in Adelaide, 18th to 20th of June, you see it on the slide there. Get online today and register. There's a chance it will sell out this year. So spots at a premium. And so you get on there. We really look forward to seeing as many people in Adelaide as we can. So thank you again, and we'll certainly see you next time, and have a great day. Thank you.